Hello and welcome to the Federal. You're watching Off the Beaten Track, a program in which we take a 360-degree view of one subject. In Indian politics, Hindu right-wing forces are now a dominating force. It wasn't like this always. For decades, it was the Congress or other parties which emerged out of what is called the Congress system or the mainstream national movement. As a result, scholarship and media coverage about Hindu right-wing forces were limited in the initial decades after India became independent. It is only from the 1980s that scholars started actually writing and researching about Hindu nationalistic movement. Journalists like me also started writing about the various organizations within this entire fold, be it the Hindu Mahasabha, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the Bharatiya Janata Party, the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, and other parties. The scholarship initially was essentially restricted to trying to read what were their pioneering, inspiring texts, the history of how these organizations grew. But something very fresh came into the area of the scholarship of Hindu right-wing forces in the year 2000, when in the leading journal of India, Economic and Political Weekly, a very pioneering work was done by an Italian scholar, completely unlikely quarters, which actually stunned all those who were tracking Hindu nationalistic movement in the country. That was Marzia Casolari, a professor of political science and especially studying Asian politics, sitting in the University of Torino, or what is also called in English as Turin. She has now, in the last few years, continued the work on what was written in that Economic and Political Weekly essay. So I will be talking to Marzia Casolari. Thank you very much for coming and joining me on this program. I have really wanted to speak with you on record for a long time because you shed light on a very important aspect on the scholarship of Hindu nationalistic politics, which is the connections between the early Hindu nationalists, the early Indian nationalists, and the European fascists and German Nazism. So I will be talking to you on all these issues, but first of all, let me welcome you to this program and thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
I have obviously read your essay and also your book, which came out first earlier in 2011, then again in 2020, your updated book came out, by which time India had been under the rule of the present government for almost 5 to 6 years. So you have seen a lot of, historical account as well as, the contemporary account also is available in your writing. One can actually make out. Now, if one actually tries to break up the various periods in which European fascism and German Nazism, had interactions with Indian nationalists, the Hindu nationalists, we can possibly break it into three clear, periods. One is the early phase, starting in the 1920s. Then we have an intensive period in the 1930s, and then a much more intensive engagement during the Second World War. Each required a fair amount of deconstruction because it involves a large number of Indian leaders who are considered to be very iconic within India. And to draw their linkages between the European fascists and the German Nazi movement, can appear to be a bit upsetting for a certain section within the country. Let me first start with the 1920s. You referred to the early linkages, the early exposure which Rabindranath Tagore had with the Italian nationalists at that time. Can you draw some, shed some light on that to start with?
Yes, sure. And I would, as you correctly, divided the three periods. I agree that these are the, crucial period regarding the relations between Indian radical nationalism and fascism and Nazism. But we have to go back a little earlier, uh, say around Italy's unification, after Italy's unification, because it was almost contemporary with the opening of the Suez Canal, and
Right.
just across the opening of the Suez Canal, where Italian engineers, by the way, worked. Across that date, the Italian government, it was the liberal government, realized the importance of this new maritime route that connected Europe and Asia. And
Okay.
Italy is a maritime country, a nation. I can't say a power. At that time, it was not really a power. I don't know if it is a power nowadays, but it's always member of the G7. But anyway, so at that time, it was a maritime nation just in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. Then the importance of the connection between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean and Asia, it was very crucial. So in politicians and writers, experts used to define the Suez Canal as the gateway, the gate to Asia. Mm. Then at the beginning, India had a commercial, an economic importance, and India was a battlefield of a political struggle between Italy and the UK.
And the UK, yes.
I don't want to, I can't go too
Yes.
much into the detail of these topics. I wrote quite extensively about it in a book in Italian, but anyway. Um, then at the beginning, it was what attracted Italy. It was the economic importance of India and of Asia in general. We should speak about also about China, that it's a much less known topic than India and Indo-Italian relations. But anyway, uh, this is important to know because to be said because when the fascist regime rose to power, there were already political bases, Italian political bases in India that were the consulates. The consulate in Calcutta, on Kolkata as you call it today, and in Bombay at that time, and Mumbai today. So there was a consulate that became in Calcutta, that became soon a consulate general, and the consulate in Mumbai. So these were especially Calcutta was the basis of where political ties with the Indian um, political environment were created and nurtured.
Right.
So everything started from there, and it started actually in the in the second half of the 1920s. And all these activities were connected with a few figures like Gino Scarpa, who was at the beginning, he reached India from Afghanistan and the Soviet Union, if I'm not wrong, in 1928 or so, anyway, at the end of the 1920s. And he came to Asia, he came to that part of Asia as a young official of the Italian government, and
Right.
then he became soon the commercial attaché, and then after that, the consul general, Italian consul general in Calcutta. So
Right.
he was the key figure who developed, the connections between the fascist regime and
And
the political
Indian nationalism.
Bengali political environment.
Right.
And you can stop me whenever you want if you want to ask questions, by
I'm
the way.
asking you that
Anyway, so
Tagore went to, he visited Italy and he had some, interaction with the Italian leadership at that time. But we get
I,
the impression from your book, that it does not get carried forward beyond the point because Rabindranath Tagore, did not engage much with the fascist forces at that time. So if you could tell me about it, it
yeah,
would.
but Tagore is anyway. thank you for mentioning him. But I was coming to the point, not exactly to Tagore, but to Giuseppe Tucci and Carlo Formichi, who were two Indologists. Tucci was a Sanskrit scholar, Tibetan scholar. He was expert of Buddhism and Tibet. He traveled quite a lot across India, Tibet, and Italy. And what I mention in my book, I don't know if you have seen it, if you have read it. I mean, you have read the book, but if you remember this detail, actually, Giuseppe Tucci was paid by the Italian regime. So he was the initiator, he with Scarpa, was the initiator of the relationships, political relationships with with Indian nationalists.
Right.
And it's important that it was Bengal, the first area of Italian political expansion, because this connection with Bengal lasted up to the end when Subhash Chandra Bose was involved. So
Right.
Italian, you know, diplomats or agents or whatever it was, they could develop ties with Subhash Chandra Bose because they had already prepared,
In fact,
the
you are
yeah,
talking about, Bengal engagement. There are three very important Indian nationalists that you talk about. Continued political engagement with Italian, fascist forces, and the Italian government. That is Subhash Chandra Bose, of course, is there. Then there is Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, and then from the 1930s there is Raj Bihari Bose. You also,
yes,
in your book, you actually also shed light that how Italians, the Italian government also engaged with the leaders from the other western side, from the Bombay side, which is essentially, Hedgewar, who had established the RSS, B.S. Munje, who at one point used to be the mentor of Mr. Hedgewar, but was a kind of a constant shuffling between Hindu Mahasabha and the RSS, and of course, then most important being Mr. V.D. Savarkar, who was the ideologue of Hindu nationalistic organizations. So it
yeah,
also
that came.
in Maharashtra in Western India.
Yeah, it came later on because from Calcutta, the Italians carried out a very intensive anti-British propaganda,
Right.
both before and across for instance, the Ethiopian War. No, and that propaganda. Uh, I think that it was thanks to that propaganda that Italian fascism became famous in India. I don't know how the knowledge about Italian fascism shifted from Bengal to Maharashtra.
Maharashtra.
Actually, I know because there were connections between the RSS and the Bengali secret societies, and
Yes,
I mentioned in my book.
yes.
There were ties between Edgar
Yes.
himself and the Anushilan Samiti. So that was the channel through which the knowledge and contacts between these Indian political circles and fascist Italy came out. They emerged.
In,
But political, I mean, there are two phases in the relations uh, between the Marathi nationalists, the Marathi uh, radicals, and Hindu. I don't like using nationalists because even the term nationalists referring to these people is
on that.
controversial.
Yes.
I don't even use the term fundamentalist, even although it would be perhaps more appropriate. But anyway, so these are the connections um, between Italy and the Marathi radical leaders had two specific phases. One was the early 1930s when B.S. Munge came to Italy and he met Mussolini in 1931.
Right.
And I published a long
You published a long
report.
essay, and also, in your book, you spent a lot of time as to how he got inspired by the fascist organizations there and came here and actually conveyed to Hedgewar that RSS must be developed on those lines. Can you tell a bit about that?
Yeah, well, he came to Rome, and his visit to Rome was carefully prepared by several Indian and Italian personalities. He came to Rome and he visited the military academies, some military academies and schools in Rome, and the organizations, the youth organizations of fascism, like Balilla and Avanguardisti. There were the militant organizations where the guys used to perform drills and so on. And it was a paramilitary training that should be used not just in a war or in a civil war,
Right.
uh, but they should be trained against their enemies, and the enemies were the anti-fascists, basically the anti-fascists and the opponents of the
Very,
regime.
yeah.
So he was so inspired, B.S. Munge, by what he said that he wrote in his notebook that once he went back to India, he would, reshape the RSS according to the fascist
Right.
paramilitary organizations. And this is exactly what he did. And after coming to India, so from the early 1930s onwards, he worked very intensively also for opening paramilitary schools, military schools in India and academies.
They opened it in Western India. It was very much part of later on, and it continues in some form even today, and has been very controversial because of alleged connections with various Hindu militant activities in about 15-20 years ago. Let me
So
take.
that was the early stage, and then at the end of the 1930s, there was again a new phase of fascination, but even of contacts between the Hindutva, organizations, both
Right,
the RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha, but especially the Hindu Mahasabha that in that period, and the fascist regime.
right,
So I found an amount of articles published by both the Kesuri and the Maratha about fascism and about Mussolini. That
right.
he was admired. They admired him because he was the state, the man who built up the fascist state, the man who brought back order in the political chaos of post-unification Italy, and so on. So he was very much appreciated as a political organized, as a statesman, and also the social, reforms of fascism were appreciated and so on. So that was the second phase, and the second phase, and the consulate in Mumbai became very active in spreading political literature among those circles. And then these, contacts between fascism and the Marathi
Marathi.
political milieu went on going towards the war, and especially across the Second World War. But in 1937, I think it was during the electoral campaign, Savarkar he was, you know, uh,
By the time
released,
Savarkar had been released from jail, he was free to move
and
around,
he was, yeah,
and also
and he spent some time, some years at home, at home. Arrests and so. But anyway, he campaigned in 1937, and in his speeches, he repeated several times that in order to solve the Muslim problem, what he defined the Muslim problem in India, um, India, politicians in India should imitate Germany.
should imitate
Should
German.
do should do what the Nazi government did in He didn't use the term Nazi. He used the term German, but
Yes,
Germany in 1937 was quite much.
yes. You said that what the
And there is
Germans did.
one more point, that the concentration camps, that we can say, okay, no, they didn't know, perhaps he didn't know that there were how Jews were treated in Germany and so on. But that's a nonsense, because the Nazism started to discriminate and to internate Jews in concentration camps straight away from 1933. So in 1937, it was known what was going on in Germany.
Right,
But unlike now that we have, the telephones, and we can, take pictures or videos of what is going on, for instance, in Gaza, then we see the horror, straight away. I mean, uh, directly. At that time, it was not possible, but people knew what was going on. I mean, at least the suspicion, no, about what was going on. So Savarkar couldn't ignore about the violence that was going on in Germany, because it
Germany.
was very open and okay.
Now, let me go back. You talk about Savarkar. Let me go back very briefly to Subhash Chandra Bose. You write that he made an explicit reference to fascism and that he considered it to be a form of socialism. That he said that it was actually fascism was a very effective means of creating something which was a very efficient organizer of society and to bring in discipline and order. So this search for order and discipline, which led to just justifying fascism in some way, not completely under Bose, and the same thing continued under Savarkar and even RSS leaders Golwalkar or Munje at that time. And we see the same kind of an argument even today in today's India, that society needs to be organized and disciplined. And that is what is happening today in India under the present government. There are very strong similarities which one can actually see. So, do you think that this idea of fascism is what attracted the Indian nationalists of that time, and especially the Hindu radical leaders?
Yes, I think so. But there is another point, that in Italy during fascism, criminality was there. So keeping order and discipline means punishing the criminals, basically.
Right,
But at that time, criminals were, the corruption was there. There was a very high range of corruption in Italian society during the fascist regime. Fascists, some, not all of them, some of them were very, very straight, very, correct, but many of them were corrupt. Corruption was it was a problem within the fascist government, among the fascist officials and so on. That was just an excuse. That was just political propaganda, and it was just an excuse to justify the massive use of violence.
right.
Actually, violence was not used very much. Okay, it was used also against the criminals, but the criminals could escape justice in a way or another.
And
Uh,
did you find similar kind of linkages between the philosophy of Hindutva and violence? This has been pointed out by, another scholar of Savarkar, Vinayak Chaturvedi, who has also commented on your book and talked about it in very high terms. He has also established the linkages between violence and Hindutva. Do you think that influence came from the fascist forces?
Well, if I have in mind Hindutva in the stricter sense, like according to Savarkar's concept, Savarkar's book, for instance, he doesn't mention violence openly, but violence comes out when you shape, when you draw out an internal enemy.
Right,
So the Muslims were considered, they were the ideal scapegoat,
right.
especially after the publication of Hindutva. it was already there before, because violence against Muslims started in the late 19th century, when the first secret societies were opened in Maharashtra by Bal Gangadhar Tilak.
Right.
But Savarkar is the only real ideologue of the Hindu right wing.
That's right.
We may like or dislike his ideology, but he was an ideologue.
Yes, that
So
is
he systematized the idea of the idea of the internal enemy. It doesn't define the Muslims as internal enemies, but it's quite clear because he defines them as alliance. No, because they not just because they knew very well that Indian Muslims were Indians. They, I mean, blood, they were Indian. They are Indians. No, they couldn't ignore this particular. But the way in that book he says that the there are holy places, Muslim sacred places are outside India. So their loyalty is
is
outside India
outside India. That's what he's
because they have their loyalty in Mecca. So it doesn't speak about Christians, for instance. So also Christians would have. I mean, that's there. It's not mentioned, but it's there, and it came out later on, especially in recent times. Again the attacks against the Christians, because you can use the same logic. Christians,
okay.
their holy places are outside India. They are in Rome. So what to do? I mean, that is the idea. No, that's first of all, they worship. They have sacred holy places outside India. Then they can't be loyal to India. And in order to become Hindus, I mean, Hindutva is not Hinduism, as you know.
That's right.
It's Hinduness. Then to become Hindu in that it's a cultural and social definition. Cultural in the sense, even in the daily sense of the culture of the simple culture, no, like eating, the way you eat, the way you dress, the way to marry. That's culture in a very common sense. So unless Muslims start to eat and to dress and to get married as Hindus do, they will never be considered true Indians.
Right. Now let me ask.
Because he writes a lie basically in that book, because he writes that Indian Muslims consider themselves Muslim first, and then Indians. That's not true, because if you speak up and at that time also, I mean, also the leaders who later on founded Pakistan, they consider themselves Indian at that time.
Right. Right.
And if you speak to a Muslim nowadays and you ask him, "Where are you from?" he says, "I'm an Indian." He doesn't say, "I'm a Muslim."
Right. Right. That actually remains. Now, let me ask you something, which is actually quite difficult for Indians to really to understand. The decision of Subhash Chandra Bose to go and side with the Axis forces during the Second World War and try to fight against the British by the help from the Germans and other Axis powers. How do you explain that? You have studied this thing. Can you just tell us something about it?
Yes, I didn't go too much into the details of Subhash figure, because many other scholars did, and I didn't have much new to say about him. But anyway, there is a book that I just finished to read yesterday, because I'm supposed to review it, and it deals exactly also with this subject, because it's about the crisis of imperialism, the fascism um, across the Second World War.
Right.
The writer is Michael Ortiz. It's a tough book, but it's very interesting and the author gives an explanation about why Subhash Chandra Bose joined the Axis powers.
Right.
Well, here there were basically three trends within Indian nationalism. One was the secular Gandhian and Nehruvian, the Congress nationalism, that it was against Britain. It was anti-colonial by definition, and
Right.
these nationalists wanted to oppose during the Second World War. They wanted to continue to oppose the colonial rule, deciding to not to support Britain during the Second World War. That
Mhm.
was the one decision. Ammon Roy, that he was a communist,
Right.
he wanted to support the Allies, the Anglo-Americans, because he was convinced that after the Second World War, imperialism would collapse.
Right.
And then he was an anti-fascist and
Right.
anti-Nazist because he was a communist, but he thought that he wanted to use, to exploit in a way the Anglo-Americans to fight Nazism, to uh, eradicate Nazism and fascism,
Right.
but because he was convinced that this effort, I mean, that the Anglo-Americans would win the war, that it would be a Pyrrhic, victory, and that at the end of the war, Britain and the United States, but especially Britain, would be, and colonial powers in general, would be so weakened that they would disappear. And in that way, he was right. So Subhash Chandra Bose was the opposite, because he was convinced that he could, he and his followers could defeat the
Yeah.
colonial power with the help
Right.
of
Oh.
yeah. But he was not. You can't say I don't believe that, and I don't define. I don't believe that Netaji Subhash was a fascist or a Nazist or even a sympathizer for. He admired Nazism, certain aspects of Nazism and fascism,
Right.
but he was not.
He was
I
not
mean,
a
if you, hmm?
he
Yeah,
was not a fascist, but he admired certain aspects of Nazism as well as European fascism, especially Italian. And as we said, that he used to think of it as some kind of socialism. Now, let me move on to my last question. As we reach to the concluding part of our discussion, we are moving into a very contemporary issue. You talked about as to how Savarkar was influenced by Nazism, how he considered the Germans, what they were doing to the Jews was a correct decision, that he felt that it was, after all, Hitler was more competent to decide what should be done to Jews. Now, definitely at that time, the Indian Hindutva forces were anti-Jew. But in today's world, what we are seeing with the war going on in the Middle East, with Hamas and Israel, we see that the Indian state has been backing more than the previous governments the Israeli forces. There is greater embrace of Jews and of Zionism. Do you think that this is essentially their anti-Muslim politics is taking dominance over everything else?
yes, I think so. I wrote an essay on this. I mean, on the shifting, India's shifting foreign policy, and across, from the early 2000, it was published in, the essay was published in 2019, 2020, perhaps 2020. So it was just, a review of Indian foreign policy until that date.
Mhm.
And yes, it's India is adopting Israeli methods. For instance, in Kashmir, the situation is in Kashmir, at least in 2020, 2020 was very similar to the situation in Palestine, no, where the Kashmiris were locked in, and the elimination of Article 370 of the Constitution and so on, but especially this segregation and discrimination that is going on, and violence that is going on in Kashmir, and the violence that is going on in India, all over India against Muslims. So yes,
Targeting of
so
Muslims.
and you know now it's open that and I wrote it. It was in 2020. No, it was I started writing it in 2019, and it was published in 2020. Um, I started actually writing that article in the early 2020, in January or February, just during Donald Trump's visit to India.
Right.
So it was then early 2020, just after the CIA. That's very similar, CIA is just the application of Goldwalker's theory, according to which, or statement better than theory, Goldwalker statement according to which Muslims Indian Muslims should be deprived of the citizenship, like Jews in Germany, no, and in
Well,
Italy, because also in Italy they were deprived of the citizenship.
in fact, in your book, in the last bit
Yeah.
towards the conclusion, you say, that today when the BJP is in power and the Sangh Parivar is as strong as never before in Indian history, it is possible to confirm Nehru's definition of Hindu nationalism as an Indian version of fascism. But we can go further, you say, and define today's Sangh Parivar as an Indian version of Nazism. These are fairly strong words that you use in this book. We will leave it here, and thank you very much for coming and sharing your thoughts on something which is actually very important in Indian politics today, which we need to understand the linkages, which I would hope that our viewers do read up, do read your articles, do read your views, your book, because they actually shed light on something on which there has not been much Indian scholarship, especially the linkages between the Hindutva ideologues and the European fascists of the 1930s and 1940s. Thank you very much, Professor Casolari, for coming and
Thank
joining.
you very much for inviting me. Thank you again. Bye.
Bye bye. Thank you very
Bye.
much. I will share the link with you once this
Yes,
is.
please.
Yes.
Yes, please. Perhaps I could say more, but for instance, the connections between, that Israel is selling arms to India, and selling arms, and it's giving advice, and there are advisors, Israeli advisors. The Mossad is working in, especially in Kashmir, and the
Maybe
security.
what I will do is that just give me some days. I will, type out, 5 questions and send it to you, and you can reply at length, and then I will write an article out of it, as to.
But as you are a journalist, are we online now? No.
No, we are on the line, but yes, it will not be part of the program.
Better for you to cut it. But anyway, no. Can you find out any evidence of Mossad's work in Kashmir?
Very difficult. It is
I
very.
can imagine, because one guy who mentioned it in an article was Robert Fisk, but unfortunately Robert Fisk is no more,
Right. Anyway,
and it's difficult. Hmm?
I will check out.
You check out. Be careful, but check out,
Thank you.
because it's very important.
Thank you.
Yeah, that you should notice one particular, that the Mumbai attack in was it in 2007 or 2008, the Mumbai attack at
2008.
the Taj Mahal Hotel,
2000,
2008.
November 2008.
2008. I noticed immediately that Israel offered assistance to
Right.
the Indian government to catch the terrorists, and Mossad agents helped the Indian the Indian army from the very beginning. They were ready to help, and they actually helped the Indian army, the Indian officers. So that security forces, special security forces, I have to say. So how could they? If they could act so quickly, it means that they were already there. And Mumbai is a port town, so it's I don't know if there are military, installments around Bombay or not. There are, and these are, connections. So sorry if I
No,
mentioned
no,
such a sensitive topic, but you
thank
can
thank you
destroy
very
this part of whatever. Anyway, Nilanjan, thank you very much again. I hope I said, something sensical.
much. No, it is. It is. It is.
Take care.
Subscribe to the Federal's YouTube page for more news and updates.